This video will be a review of the top 10 best books I read in the year of 2025. It will not necessarily include all the books I have read this year, nor will it include books I partially read, which is often the case, but it will include books I read from beginning to end and from which I gained genuine value. So without further ado, let us begin. At number 10, The Myth of the Machine, The Pentagon of Power by Lewis Mumford. I first familiarized myself with this book at the beginning of the year, using it as a source material for my video titled The Mega Machine and the Death of Civilization. But it was not until the end of the year that I finally decided to finish reading the book in its entirety. The book itself is actually the second volume of a two-volume critique of technological civilization by the 20th century American historian, sociologist, and philosopher Lewis Mumford. Across these two volumes, Mumford develops his concept of the megamachine, a form of organized human power in which large populations are integrated through technical, bureaucratic, and hierarchical structures into a single, coordinated, monolithic apparatus capable of immense techno-scientific mechanization and planetary-scale resource extraction. Whilst the first volume focuses on the ancient civilizations of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and other early imperial power complexes, the second volume traces the transformation of the megamachine from the late medieval period into the rise of European empires and the onset of early modernity. Mumford pays particular attention to the conquistadors and the emergence of the Spanish Empire, which he argues set the precedent for the global, expansionist and militarized techniques that would come to define Western modernity. Most notably, Mumford believed that the transfer of the megamachine into Europe stemmed from a series of converging developments in the late medieval period. The biotechnics of medieval life were increasingly subsumed into monotechnics under the rise of centralized monarchical and authoritarian regimes. Early cities were transformed into epicenters of resource concentration, administrative control, and proto-industrial coordination for expanding population centers. The legacy of the Crusades considerably entrenched this trajectory as a religious military campaign of feudal imperialism and early colonial expansion. Medieval Christian materialism, which had traditionally endowed certain objects, relics, and places with sacred significance, gradually gave way to an emerging rationalist attitude toward the natural world, treating the earth more as an object to be known, mapped, classified, and observed. Medieval Christian eschatology also played a defining role in this movement towards a more world-transforming order of final consummation. Furthermore, the refinement of scientific methods through long-distance naval navigation created a new technical worldview grounded in measurement, calculation, and the coordinated conquest of space. At the same time, mercantile trading networks fused with emerging financial institutions and ecclesiastical authority, producing a synthesis of technical, economic, political, and religious power. Finally, Europe inherited certain ideological residues from Imperial Rome and ancient Greece, traditions that placed sacred significance on the laws and order of causation and mechanism, providing the cultural and intellectual structures for the fully articulated megamachine of early modernity. For understanding the manifestations of megatechnics in the 19th and 20th centuries, Mumford points to the emergence of modern militaries throughout the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries, as establishing the formative foundations of the industrial megamachine. Accordingly, these new modern armies created the institutional conditions in which human beings could be mobilized, homogenized, drilled, and tested en masse for purposes of large-scale coordinated power. This development, he suggests, prefigured the later industrial and bureaucratic systems that would extend the same principles of regimentation, standardization, and mechanical obedience into every sector of modern society. From the entire book, my favorite quote was this one, quote, "To become the lords and possessors of nature was the ambition that secretly united the conquistador, the merchant adventurer, and banker, the industrialist, and the scientist, radically different though their vocations and their purposes might seem," unquote. This line expresses how relations of power bind together otherwise disparate social and institutional agents into a singular civilizational project, from which the conquest of nature served as the unifying horizon of Western modernity. A shared telos through which these different agents legitimized their authority in the transformation of the material world. Undeniably, this relation and network of power in a Foucauldian sense remains entirely present for an analysis of megatechnics in the 21st century. Whilst I gained a much greater understanding of the historical development of human techniques across the era of what we consider modernity, or Western modernity, I only placed this book at the lower end of my ranking simply due to the fact it was the longest book I read of this year, and honestly, towards the end of the book, it began to feel more like a chore than a pleasure to finish. Additionally, Mumford often dwells on highly specific aspects of megatechnics, such as detailed discussions of utopian communities, or particular technical and scientific developments, whereas I was personally more interested in a broader structural overview. Nevertheless, I am glad to have completed this book, and I would strongly encourage anyone interested in the history and philosophy of technics and technology to explore the works of Lewis Mumford. At number 9, On Anarchism by Noam Chomsky. Just to be clear, my initial reading and assessment of this book took place before I became fully aware of Noam Chomsky's documented association with Jeffrey Epstein. Whilst this relation between Chomsky and Epstein has certainly raised ethical concerns, complicated his public legacy, and brought some of his reasoning into questioning, I think it is important to acknowledge this context whilst also generally distinguishing it from a critical engagement with the ideas presented in this specific book. Although I cannot deny my impression of Chomsky has certainly changed since the revelation and has made me question some of Chomsky's motives. Nevertheless, here is my analysis prior to my full understanding of the situation. The political philosopher and linguist Noam Chomsky was deeply influential in my early engagement with the theories and philosophies of socialism and anarchism. Many of the values he articulates regarding worker struggles, workplace democracy, individual liberty, and the critique of hierarchy, authoritarianism, and totalitarianism have undoubtedly shaped my political outlook in a broad and lasting way. Although I was already familiar with much of Chomsky's work, I chose to read On Anarchism to gain a more complete and holistic understanding of his political philosophy, and in fact, it ended up being the final book I completed this year. His book On Anarchism is a collection of essays, interviews, and political reflections that together outline the core themes of his anarchist thought. Drawing on philosophical figures such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Mikhail Bakunin, and Rudolf Rocker, Chomsky defines anarchism as a suspicion and skepticism towards human hierarchies, and as a political orientation aligned with the Enlightenment ideals of liberty, equality, and voluntary cooperation, emphasizing the pursuit of societal arrangements that maximize individual freedom whilst minimizing coercive authority. For Chomsky, a society freed from authoritarian and oppressive structures would enable human beings to realize and manifest their creative, cooperative, and self-governing capacities, which he believes are often stifled under existing institutions of capitalist power structures. Much of the book focuses on the anarchist movement during the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939, where Chomsky challenges mainstream liberal narratives about the Spanish anarchists and exposes how the authoritarian and hierarchical leadership of the Soviet Union under Stalin actively suppressed the anarchist revolution to prevent the emergence of a genuinely democratic, horizontal, and decentralized workers' society. For Chomsky, this demonstrates how socialist and communist movements can themselves become hierarchical and antithetical to the ideals of revolutionary human emancipation they claim to uphold. He also briefly touches on linguistics, relating the human capacity for language to an innate creative impulse, one that, in his view, flourishes best in social conditions free from hierarchical domination and coercion. As much as I believe it is important to challenge hierarchies and capitalist systems of power in the 21st century, it still remains unclear to me how anarchism, from Chomsky's perspective, can address the questions concerning techniques and technology, which, under neoliberal regimes, often often utilize the language of egalitarianism and progress to conceal hidden techno-scientific power relations and structures. Chomsky has elsewhere described technology as a hammer, capable of either building or destroying, and that metaphor might provide some hints towards his broader outlook on techno-science. However, he has also dismissed the threat of artificial intelligence, regarding it as an unnecessary concern reserved for science fiction, although I do not know whether his position has changed since then, given the rapid acceleration in AI development and deployment. Chomsky is further known for not having a very favorable view on postmodernist and post-structuralist critiques, which all to varying extents address the concerns of modern techno-science. I suppose my main concern with Chomsky's perspective is how can socialism and anarchism, or any other revolutionary movement, truly realize its own ideals if it simply inherits techno-scientific infrastructures, believing that these forces are necessary for the emergence of an egalitarian and horizontal society? Does it not risk re-establishing the very hierarchies it sought to abolish, albeit under subtler, technologically mediated forms? Besides from my own niche perspective, I think this book provides a very open framework for engaging with anarchist values and ideas, offering greater insight into how libertarian socialist and anarchist ideals diverge from historical Marxist orthodoxies, and revealing that left-orientated theories are never adopted neutrally, but are always interpreted and applied through conditions which may or may not pave way to new forms of hierarchies. At number 8, Friedrich Nietzsche by J.P. Stern. If anyone has watched my previous videos, they will know I am deeply influenced by the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, and I read this book in hopes of summarizing and consolidating my understanding of Nietzsche's central ideas. The Czech-British literary theorist J.P. Stern can also be found in an excellent interview on Nietzsche's philosophy in Brian McGee's Great Philosophers series from the 1980s, with a focus on Nietzsche's diagnosis of modern Germany in the mid to late 19th century. Stern highlights the conditions that inclined Nietzsche to call for a re-evaluation of all values, a response to what he saw as the profound decadence and nihilism of his epoch, the notions of the will to power, and the overhuman ideal of course being two modalities through which Nietzsche sought to open new channels of human overcoming. For Stern, however, Nietzsche's break with the legacies of enduring Christian values which informed many of the ruling moralities and ideologies of his time did not therefore implicate him as a proto-fascist thinker, nor reduce him solely to a precursor of existentialism. Instead, Stern presents Nietzsche as a philosopher of rupture, a thinker who deliberately experimented with multiple voices and literary masks to widen the horizon of his philosophical perspectives in the overcoming of inherited Christian values. This method of shifting standpoints not only dissolves the idea of a single unified author-subject, but also compels the reader into an active role of interpretation, one that must navigate the ambiguities, paradoxes, and provocations that typically define Nietzsche's style. Stern also reminds us that Nietzsche did not condemn virtues which are typically associated with Christian morality, such as compassion, as inherently or universally negative. Rather, Nietzsche argued that in the specific context of his own time, compassion had come to play an inhibiting role in human flourishing, functioning less as a life-affirming virtue and more as a moralized restraint. In this context, compassion was increasingly sentimentalized, overextended, and used to conceal more ambivalent and sinister human drives that treated people as weak, dependent, and infantilized, thereby justifying their continued supervision and control by paternalistic modern power structures. Undeniably, this remains a persistent phenomenon today, especially in my own country, the UK, where a neoliberalized, over-sentimentalized discourse of compassion is routinely utilized to obfuscate structures of neoliberal domination. As Stern reaffirms of the fundamentally perspectival character of Nietzsche's valuation in what is perhaps my favorite quote from the book, that, quote, "Compassion is weakness in one situation, strength in another. Love is an aristocratic virtue, or again a decadent romantic sickness. History is debilitating, or again a source of myth and strength. Nihilism is the nether end of decadence, or winter's last throes before spring sets in. There seems to be no end to those apparent or partial contradictions, all of them illustrative of Nietzsche's insistence that man alone, and not fate or a god or society, is the bestower of values, that the personal being of man must determine what is valuable, and not the other way round, and that the insights he can achieve are not subjective, the subject too being a mere linguistic convenience, but relative and perspectivist." Unquote. Nietzsche's perspectivism reveals that values, virtues, and even truths transform their meaning according to the life position, vitality, and perspective of the one who evaluates them. A value is never a timeless or universally valid formation of meaning. It arises from particular modes of life and is created by human beings rather than discovered. A perspective, in turn, is rooted in one's embodied context, drives, psychology, history, and form of life. Whilst no perspective can claim total objectivity, some perspectives are nevertheless higher, stronger, and more life-enhancing than others. I think honestly the worst way to come away from Nietzsche's philosophy is to simply reject everything associated with the legacies of Christianity, whilst uncritically embracing some rugged, pre-modern form of power worship and hierarchical morality. Certainly this was never Nietzsche's intention, and Stern reminds us of the nuanced complexities inherent in interpreting Nietzsche's thought. At number 7, Psychopolitics, Neoliberalism and New Technologies of Power by Byung. I've been familiar with this book for many years and have quoted from it in previous videos. However, this year I decided to read it in its entirety, and it was actually the first book I read this year. The Korean-German philosopher Byung is also one of my favorite philosophers, especially for his insights into the human condition of the 21st century. In the book, Han argues that the emerging technologies of neoliberal capitalism are not merely external systems operating at the level of society, but internal systems operating at the level of the psyche, shaping the mind, behaviors, desires, and subjectivities of neoliberal subjects who interact with such technologies. Notably, Han describes this as psychopolitics, a subtle form of power that governs through persuasion, libidinal desire, self-optimization, and the internalization of neoliberal imperatives, rather than through overt hierarchical coercion. In this sense, neoliberal capitalist power functions less by repression and more by inducing individuals to voluntarily optimize, compete, self-expose, and exploit themselves, producing both self-optimized laborers for greater market efficiency and new forms of psychological pathology and exhaustion. In contrast to Foucault's biopolitics of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which focused on the discipline of bodies at the scale of the panoptic spaces of enclosure, Han's psychopolitics focuses on the discipline of the psyche, beyond any given space or place. In this sense, the panopticon of Foucault's disciplinary society has thereby been decentralized in the 21st century, moving from external surveillance to self-imposed psychological surveillance under the imperatives of neoliberal technologies. The social media app TikTok serves as a paradigmatic example of what Han describes, where neoliberal subjects are constantly engaged in performance, libidinal activation, and self-advertisement, generating desire and attention for the maximization of digital labor, data, capital, and consumption at any place or time. The temporary banning of TikTok in certain regions and the subsequent migration of American users to the similar Chinese social media platform named Xiaohongshu, also known as RedNote, further illustrates the internalization of these global mechanisms of psychic desire and mass control beyond borders. In a very dialectical sense, Han perceives freedom as being inverted into unfreedom, whilst in a distinctly Nietzschean manner, he recognizes freedom and unfreedom as coexisting side by side in the neoliberal society. In my video titled Bodies, Beauty, Desire, and Modern Neoliberal Capitalism, you will find quotes from this book being utilized. And given the current trajectory of technologies under global neoliberal capitalism, I will likely continue to utilize this book for future videos. At number 6, Capitalism and the Death Drive by Byung. This is another book I've read by Han, and it is a work I have referenced in my videos The Mega Machine and the Death of Civilization and Death Denial, Neoliberal Capitalism and the Human Conquest of Nature. Drawing on Freud, Han identifies modern capitalist civilization as being fueled by death-driven tendencies towards the earth, as seen in the relentless exploitation of natural resources, climate change and ecological destruction, and the systemic extraction of value from both human and non-human life. According to Hahn, central to this death-driven logic of global capitalism is a pervasive death denial that casts a spectre across the living of neoliberal capitalist societies. The masses, stripped of pre-modern modes of life that once incorporated the ritual significance of death, are rendered alienated from the natural conditions of life and mortality, whilst the capitalist elites, who have transformed the earth into a sheer resource and resent their condition of human mortality, extract vast resources and hoard capital as a means to achieve symbolic immortality over an otherwise mortal earth. At all levels of neoliberal capitalist regimes, death is suppressed and resublimated into the drive for relentless extraction, production, consumption, and accumulation, producing a civilization both collectively self-suicidal and spiritually impoverished. A quote which I think captures this understanding of death denial in relation to Hahn's notion of psychopolitics is the following passage, quote, "The separation of life and death that is constitutive of the capitalist economy creates an undead life. Death in life. Capitalism generates a paradoxical death drive. It deprives life of life. A life without death, which is what capitalism strives to achieve, is what is truly deadly. Performance zombies, fitness zombies, and Botox zombies. These are manifestations of undead life. The undead lack any vitality. Only life that incorporates death is truly alive. The mania for health is the biopolitical manifestation of capital itself." Unquote. For Hahn, whilst it would seem that neoliberal capitalism promotes life in terms of health, youth, activity, productivity, and consumption, it actively conjures the opposite result, or what he describes as death in life, as human vitality is replaced by compulsive biopolitical self-maintenance upon an earth devoid of any relation to the human. The life drive, therefore, becomes a death drive towards a resentful and nihilistic existence. In the book, Hahn also turns to aesthetics and eroticism, directing his critique towards those such as the American artist Jeff Koons, the German stage director Benedict von Peter, and the broader contemporary film industry. For Hahn, these respective artistic practices capitulate to the pornographic condition of neoliberal libidinal economies. The pornographic, as he defines it, is fixated on the immediate, the overexposed, and the endlessly available sensory stimulus, a visual regime orientated toward instantaneous satisfaction and on-demand ejaculation. According to Hahn, the glossy hypervisibility of Koons' sculptures and the sensory saturation found in von Peter's productions operate within the same aesthetic logic. They abandon distance, mystery, and opacity in favor of a total exposure that reflects the economy of porn itself. Hahn also extends this critique to contemporary cinema, arguing that its insistent reliance on extreme close-ups, particularly of faces and certain body parts, reproduces the pornographic structure of attention. Just as pornography isolates the genitals to extract maximal stimulus, the cinematic close-up fractures the body and renders each isolated part a sexualized organ of the pornographic gaze. The erotic, in contrast to the pornographic, relies on distance, ambiguity, symbolic relations, and the slow intensification of desire. The erotic crucially draws from suggestion rather than saturation, from withholding rather than overwhelming. For Hahn, however, this aesthetic mode is increasingly eliminated under neoliberal aesthetic regimes and libidinal economies that favor hypervisibility over ambiguity, restraint, and the time required for desire to emerge. Whilst I personally preferred this book by Hahn over his book on psychopolitics, largely because of its intriguing insights into the existential structuring of neoliberal capitalism and the nihilistic regimes of life it produces, I won't deny that it does become somewhat repetitive towards the end, and the book does begin to repeat itself by that point. Nevertheless, it provided me with a profound understanding of how neoliberal capitalism shapes the human in the absence of recognizing human mortality, and how, in the drive to biopolitically extend human life, capitalism actually assumes a death drive of its own making. At number 5, China's Legalists, the Earliest Totalitarians and Their Art of Ruling, by Zhengyuan Fu. This book examines the ancient Chinese political philosophy of legalism, which emerged during the Warring States period of Chinese history as a result of intensified power struggles and the decline of feudal aristocracies, which gave rise to increasingly centralized states. Notable founding figures of the legalist school include Xiang Yang and Han Fei, each contributing to a vision of political order grounded in strict hierarchical laws and an impersonal state authority. The philosophies of Confucianism, Mohism, Taoism, and the broader hundred schools of thought were similarly constructed and contested during this era, forming the intellectual battleground on which legalism defined its sharply contrasting doctrines. With a focus on the broader doctrine of legalism, the Chinese studies scholar Zhengyuan argues convincingly that legalism constituted a form of ancient, pre-modern totalitarianism, one centered on the techniques of bureaucratic state administration and the concentrated authority of the imperial ruler to secure total control over all domains of society. At the beginning of the book, however, Zhengyuan notes that the founding legalist scholars justified the foundations of this impersonal, totalitarian philosophy by drawing selectively on elements from existing Chinese traditions and philosophies. From Confucianism, they appropriated the concern for social order whilst disregarding its moral humanism. From Mohism, they borrowed the ideal of impartial rule whilst rejecting its ethical universalism. And from Taoism, they extracted a doctrine of non-interference that they reinterpreted as the ruler's strategic withdrawal to maintain inscrutable authority. With legalism adopted as the official guiding ideology of the Qin dynasty, the first dynasty to rule over a unified China, Zhengyuan argues that the Qin legal codes, grounded in legalist doctrine, instituted a system of punitive totalitarianism that permeated every level of society. This included harsh collective punishments, exhaustive surveillance through local informant networks, rigid social regimentation, and the ruthless standardization of law, labor, and thought. Confucian scholars, especially those who criticized the ruling dynasty, were subjected to severe and often brutal repression during this period. The imperial ruler, Qin Shi Huang, meanwhile, maintained a personal order of absolute autocratic authority, cultivated through secrecy, fear, and the strategic elimination of aristocratic, bureaucratic, and intellectual rivals. Despite the brutally totalitarian, autocratic, and hierarchical character of the Qin dynasty under legalist ideology, it was nevertheless one of the most formally egalitarian societies in Chinese history, as the legalist codes applied to all subjects equally, regardless of class or social ranking. At the economic level, the legalist policies of the Qin dynasty and of later dynasties influenced by its doctrines ensured that agricultural resources were rigorously mobilized to sustain large standing armies, to prevent both internal rebellions and external incursions that threatened to destabilize imperial authority. Zhengyuan even argues that legalism instituted a kind of proto-socialism or state socialism, insofar as the extraction, production, and allocation of resources were entirely directed by the state and orientated toward the preservation of state power rather than the welfare of the people. As he writes, quote, "Ancient China's legalists were probably the earliest advocates of socialism in the form of public ownership of the means of production. Yet, the rationale for state control over the economy was never economics, but politics. Public ownership by the state is intended to reinforce the political power of the state," unquote. From this understanding, one can clearly discern a continuity of economic centralization and state-directed resource management that extends into modern China's administrative model of developmental governance, where the economy remains a political instrument designed above all to consolidate and strengthen state-building efforts. And I even left a comment on a video titled "A Communist Analysis of the Rise of China," if one wishes to see more of my analysis on the topic. For Zhengyuan, the punitive and impersonal totalitarian character of the short-lived Qin dynasty would be largely responsible for its collapse, and it was the state's craftsmen of the subsequent Han dynasty who integrated legalist doctrines with Confucian ethical principles to create a more stable and enduring imperial order. Towards the end of the book, he examines legalism in the context of China's modern revolutionary period, arguing that the Chinese communists, including Mao Zedong, saw in legalism the necessary administrative and coercive techniques to achieve the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that legalism was upheld during the Cultural Revolution as the antithesis to Confucianism, which was condemned as counter-revolutionary. Zhengyuan ultimately contends that the modern People's Republic of China is equally, if not more, shaped by the legacies of legalism than of Confucianism, as the governing institutions of the People's Republic remain structurally grounded in centralized authority, bureaucratic administration, and disciplinary state power. As Zhengyuan declares, quote, most popular texts on China characterize its cultural tradition as Confucian. Undoubtedly, Confucius and classical Confucianism did, and still do, exert great influence on the cultures of China and even those of other Asian nations. But in terms of Chinese traditional political institutions and practices, the impact of the legalists was at least as important as that of the Confucians, if not more so. In fact, the Chinese imperial political tradition is described by most Chinese historians as outside Confucian, inside legalist. Chinese traditional official orthodox Confucianism was actually an amalgam of classical Confucian rhetoric and legalist reinterpretation. Although the Chinese imperial dynastic era ended in 1911, the influence of the legalist tradition on Chinese political development can still be felt today, unquote. This book was actually the first time I had read anything about legalism, and I happened to read most of it whilst I was in China, which made the experience feel even more meaningful. If one wants to understand modern China, it is essential to become familiar with China's dynastic history and with the governing philosophies and political doctrines developed during those eras, many of which continue to shape the present. To be honest, interpreting China purely through the largely Western binary of capitalism and socialism is often unhelpful. Even though China operates within capitalist markets and ideologically identifies itself with socialism with Chinese characteristics, I think the Chinese characteristics component of that formulation carries far more weight than the socialist one. At number 4, Nietzsche as Phenomenologist, Becoming What One Is by Christine Daigle. The relationship between Nietzsche's philosophy and phenomenology has always been of interest to me, and although Nietzsche was writing before phenomenology formally emerged, there is no denying that his thought resonates clearly with many of its core concerns. In this book, the Canadian existentialist, phenomenologist, and posthumanist philosopher Christine Daigle argues that Nietzsche grounds human experience in the body, specifically in the drives, affects, and embodied forces through which humans encounter and interpret the world, drawing on a broadly Kantian understanding that we cannot access the world in itself, along with Nietzsche's rejection of Cartesian mind-body dualism. Daigle claims that it is this inner bodily dynamism, this incessant interplay of drives and perspectives, that constitutes Nietzsche's proto-phenomenological account of embodied experience and world disclosure. Daigle further affirms Nietzsche's view that consciousness emerges only secondarily, not solely from bodily drives and affects, but from the networks of social relations through which those drives are interpreted, communicated, and disciplined. For Nietzsche, consciousness is never a sovereign inner faculty. It is a public, outward-facing function, arising because humans needed to make themselves legible to one another within early communal life. Therefore, consciousness appears as a surface effect of deeper, pre-reflective forces, but one that is shaped and stabilized through the demands of communication, cooperation, and mutual interpretation within human groups. Daigle interprets this emergence as phenomenological, insofar as it is through the body, already embedded in communal practices, that the world is disclosed and shared. Human rationality, in this view, is also not an autonomous or foundational power, but a derivative interpretive layer, useful, adaptive, but always downstream from the embodied forces that constitute our primary way of being in the world. Although Daigle interprets Nietzsche's recognition of communal networks of interaction and communication as establishing the conditions through which mimetic power is formalized upon human subjectivities, she nevertheless proclaims of Nietzsche's philosophy that it is from this condition of embodiment, of being a multi-layered corporal subjectivity, participating in the ongoing dynamism of forces within the world, that the human being retains the rare possibility of actively shaping its own becoming and reinterpreting the meaning of its world, as a being always situated within the world, yet never fully determined by it. It is from this tension between social conditioning and embodied self-overcoming that Daigle situates Nietzsche's notion of the free spirit, a figure who transforms inherited interpretations through an attunement to the pre-conscious forces that constitute life. This understanding is well encapsulated in one of my favorite passages from the book, where Daigle writes, quote, "Because we are beings in the world and subjects of power, because Nietzsche's self is the product of both nature and culture, fetid spirits are the rule and free spirits are the exception. Indeed, as someone who can think differently, shed a critical eye on the world around them, and create their own values, the free spirit possesses and exercises the rare strength of self-mastery that allows them to relate to their subjection to power in a different way. As multi-layered embodied subjectivities, they are still permeated by the world, and their self is still constituted as a being in the world and a being with others. However, they are not herd-like and relate to others and the world differently." Unquote. Daigle also extends this movement of corporal human becoming in her interpretation of Nietzsche's ideal of the overhuman, who surpasses the free spirit not merely in critical autonomy, but in transformative overcoming. Aligned with the forces of the earth and animated by a heightened psychological health and will to power, the overhuman ideal becomes an artist of earthly existence itself, shaping life, value, and perception at their most fundamental levels. In doing so, they move beyond the inherited constraints of humanity, forging new evaluative horizons and embodying forms of life that appear unpredictable, even incomprehensible, to those still bound to traditional human limits. The overhuman ideal thereby heralds modes of being and sensibility previously unknown to humanity. As Daigle declares in another very grand passage that, quote, "The overhuman is a process, a being that is moved by a certain specific attitude that allows it to exist as dynamic becoming. The overhuman is an illustration, a gesturing towards what adopting the right attitude would entail in terms of the radical transformation and overcoming of the human being. Nietzsche has claimed that the overhuman is the meaning of the earth. By this he means that the overhuman is a being of this world, but more. As the meaning of the earth, the overhuman creates the world for itself and makes itself via its intentional embodied consciousness. It is crucial for Nietzsche that we become free spirits and understand the power of our grand reason and the role played by our little reason. We will be free spirits when we are freed from the weight that has been tied to our body and freed from the illusory harmful division introduced between body and soul by the metaphysical religious tradition. Understanding the kind of being that we are, and understanding that we are the creators of ourselves via our situated bodies, is liberating for the spirit. Becoming creators on that basis, and adopting and embracing the right attitudes and perspectives, will allow for the becoming overhuman, which is ultimately the ideal Nietzsche upholds." Unquote. The phenomenological dimension of Nietzsche's philosophy, which situates the human as a multifaceted being, simultaneously embedded in the world and shaped by the Earth's prior forces, yet also potentially metastable, always on the brink of becoming something different from itself and never fully determined, is often overlooked in discussions of his thought. It is ultimately at the level of embodiment that Nietzsche locates the primary site of interpretation, value creation, and world disclosure, grounding human meaning in the dynamic interplay of drives, affects, and worldly engagements. And whilst we should not literally classify Nietzsche as a phenomenologist, recognizing the phenomenological orientation of his philosophy ultimately provides a more nuanced framework for understanding how his concepts of self, power, and becoming operate from within lived horizons rather than something otherwise abstract. At number 3, A Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell. This was perhaps one of my favorite reads of this year. Quite literally, from beginning to end, I felt completely engaged with Orwell's writing. And George Orwell himself is one of my favorite writers of all time, if not my favorite. And I've read much of his other works as well. The book recounts Orwell's direct, lived experiences on the front lines whilst fighting as a soldier between 1936 and 1937 for the socialist faction of the Republican forces during the Spanish Civil War, offering a personal and unromanticized account of revolutionary struggle, factional betrayal, and the brutal reality of war itself. The book opens with Orwell's account of his arrival in Barcelona, where he encountered a real-world anarchist and working-class revolution for the first time. He describes the anarchist-controlled city as a place completely transformed by the revolution, writing that, quote, "When one came straight from England, the aspect of Barcelona was something startling and overwhelming. It was the first time that I had ever been in a town where the working class was in the saddle. Practically every building of any size had been seized by the workers and was draped with red flags or with the red and black flag of the anarchists. Every wall was scrawled with the hammer and sickle, and with the initials of the revolutionary parties. Almost every church had been gutted and its images burnt. Churches here and there were being systematically demolished by gangs of workmen. Every shop and cafe had an inscription saying that it had been collectivized. Even the bootblacks had been collectivized and their boxers painted red and black." Unquote. Indeed, what Orwell was describing was not only the political and social revolution taking place on the streets of Barcelona, but also the economic takeover of businesses, factories, shops, and public spaces by trade unions and worker collectives, reflecting a radical experiment in worker democracy, autonomy, and anarchist communal organization. It was a form of societal arrangement that had otherwise been unimaginable to Orwell, shaped as he was from his hierarchical class-ridden experiences in Britain and colonial Burma, and such a revolutionary society was remarkably distinctive for the early to mid-20th century. After joining the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, or more commonly referred to as the POUM, which was the anarchist abetting and anti-Stalinist wing of the communist movement during the Spanish Civil War, Orwell was sent to the front lines in the region of Aragon, where he experienced the harsh realities of trench warfare and the daily struggles of militia life. Upon returning on leave, he went back to Barcelona, only to witness the interfactional street battles known as the May Days, which forced him to spend several days hiding on the roof of a building for safety as street warfare ravaged the city below. Returning to the front lines, Orwell experienced the harrowing reality of war firsthand when he was shot in the neck by a nationalist sniper, a wound from which he miraculously survived. The final section of the book recounts his escape from Barcelona after the POUM was declared an illegal organization due to its anti-Stalinist associations. The pro-Soviet Republican factions, acting in alignment with Soviet military support and ideological interests, moved to suppress the party, marking a tragic turning point in the Spanish Revolution and in Orwell's personal experience of ideological betrayal. To be honest, I considered Orwell's account of war in Homage to Catalonia to be a form of absurdist literature, as he exposes the surreal and often absurd realities of the front line. He recounts, for example, the infantile way in which inexperienced militias marched to the front lines, questioning whether or not the opposition military would even bother to target them. The constant threat of injuries caused not by enemy fire, but by malfunctioning guns of fellow militiamen, and his own uncertainty over whether the bullets he fired ever actually struck an opposition soldier. Moreover, Orwell describes scavenging for food, rations, and other necessities in the trenches, the constant boredom he faced there, and the disorientating experience of being stuck on a rooftop during the May Days in Barcelona, witnessing street battles and Republican infighting. These experiences highlight the absurdity and unpredictability of armed conflict, revealing war not as a noble or heroic endeavor, but as a series of contingent, chaotic, and sometimes tragically absurd events. At number 2, Monastic Ecological Wisdom, a living tradition by Samuel Torvend. Much like Homage to Catalonia, this book was profoundly engaging, offering an entirely new set of insights into the relationship between Christianity and ecology. Whilst Christianity is often framed as antithetical to ecological thought, with many scholars rightly critiquing its anthropocentric cosmology and the dominionist interpretation of the Garden of Eden that was passed down into Promethean modernity, the American theologian Samuel Torvend illuminates a far more nuanced understanding on the relation between ecology and Christianity and early medieval monastic ecological practices. As Torvend makes clear, quote, while some historians have argued that the Christian tradition is strongly, if not overwhelmingly unfriendly to the earth, the presence of the earth in New Testament texts, songs and acclamations, worship and art argues differently. The Gospels, as biographical texts, are profoundly concerned about life in particular locations, in the earthly places where Christians gathered for worship, and what they welcomed from the created world into their common life. One might say that much of early Christian worship was ecophilic, marked by a love for the things of this earth, a love shaped by Jesus, the material presence of God in the world. Unquote. At the beginning of the book, Torvend describes the birth of Christianity and the coming of Christ to earth as a counter-imperial and counter-cosmological intervention, one that directly challenged what he sees as the earth-plundering, world-dominating ethos of Roman imperialism, in which the Roman Caesar was proclaimed lord of the earth. Whilst Torvend acknowledges that the ancient Roman world did revere and sacralize nature within its cultural and religious traditions, he argues that Rome as an imperial technical apparatus stood fundamentally opposed to these values. From its vast territorial conquests, relentless extraction of natural resources, enslavement of peoples, ecological degradation of urban environments, and to its mass slaughter of animals in both sacrificial rituals and gladiatorial spectacles, thereby revealing an empire structurally dependent on the domination and exploitation of the earth. It is within this context Torvend claims that the Apostle John denounced Rome as a violent and idolatrous power, and that the coming of Christ signified a revolutionary transformation in human values and dwelling upon the earth, as he declares that, quote, the large-scale killing of animals, sponsored by the emperor and supported by wealthy elites, was a symbol of their complete power over the universe, domination of human beings through colonization, slavery and deathly spectacles in the arena, domination of land, forests, waterways and agriculture, and domination of animals expressed Rome's desire to control all dimensions of life. In John's polemic against empire, it is not the emperor and his supportive elites who control the vast realm of animals, but rather the creator of heaven and earth, who desires peace rather than brutal domination. Unquote. For Torvend, the coming of Christ is not only a counter-imperial narrative, but a cosmic affirmation of earthly life itself, drawing on the psalmic vision in which the heavens and the earth rejoice for the coming of their Creator. Torvend interprets the incarnation as the moment in which divine presence re-enters and reanimates the whole fabric of creation. In this cosmology, Christ's arrival on earth signifies the restoration of a cosmic harmony that Roman imperial rule had ruptured. The coming of Christ, therefore, becomes a declaration that the earth and humans stand together in a shared, divinely sustained order of life, an order fundamentally opposed to the Promethean violence of the Roman Empire under Caesar. As Torvend reaffirms that, quote, in the cosmology imagined by the Psalms, the heavens are glad, the earth rejoices, the seas roar, the fields exult, and the trees of the forest sing for joy at the coming of their Creator. We do not discern a hierarchy of being in this global chorus of praise. Through Christ and for him, all things, light, darkness, soil, water, vegetation, and a vast, diverse array of creatures, were brought to life and are held together in him. Unquote. Throughout most of the book, Torvend focuses on how this ecological vision of Christ was embodied in early medieval monasticism, specifically in the Benedictine order founded by Benedict of Nursia in 6th century post-Roman Italy. Torvend argues that the rise of Benedictine monasticism was a response to the corruption and growing decadence of an inherited imperial Christianity practiced in the urban centers of the post-Roman Empire. In contrast to this deteriorating challenging urban imperial Christianity, Benedict sought to recover a life of disciplined simplicity and spiritual integrity by establishing a new Christian community in the rural hinterlands, closer to God's creation and attuned to the cycles of the natural world. The Benedictine monasteries practiced, at once, a form of ecological living rooted in Christian cosmology and a form of ecological living grounded in their direct and long-term relationship with the land itself. Founded almost always near rivers, the monastics became deeply attuned to the land's seasons, rainfall patterns, soil fertility, and ecological limits, developing practices of sustainable agriculture that transformed the monasteries into centers of vineyards, olive orchards, fisheries, grain fields, and even rudimentary animal sanctuaries. Agricultural labor was not perceived as menial work, but as a sacred participation in God's ongoing creation, integral to cultivating spiritual discipline and humility. Liturgical practices were likewise tied directly to the patterns of natural time, sunrise and sunset, seasonal changes, and the cycles of planting and harvesting, embedding monastic spirituality within the cadence of the earth rather than the technical time of cities or empires. The surrounding organic world of rivers, mountains, forests, and fields, and the animals that moved through them, served as constant reminders of God's creative presence and of humanity's embeddedness within a larger, divine cosmos. Monastic life was also profoundly horizontal and egalitarian in structure, requiring minimal possessions, shared resources, disciplined consumption, and communal, rather than private ownership of land and goods. The Benedictines additionally cultivated extensive medicinal herb gardens and healing plants, a practice that demanded close botanical knowledge and observation of varying organic properties, ensuring that the weak and sick who came to the monasteries for help could be treated and healed. For Torvend, Benedict of Nursia is himself a figure emblematic of ecological attunement and relationality, as his spirituality emerged not from abstract speculation, but from a life lived in direct and intimate contact with the natural world. Before even founding the Benedictine order, Benedict withdrew from the moral corruption of the post-imperial cities and lived as a hermit in a cave, encompassed by organic lifeforms. His spiritual practices were therefore embodied, formed through proximity to organic life and the reciprocity of the land. In this way, Benedict understood spiritual humility as becoming earth-bound, attentive to the material world and its delicate interdependence. Medieval accounts describe him protecting animals, blessing springs and water sources, and cultivating a disposition of care rather than dominion. In one well-known story, a jealous priest attempted to poison him with tainted bread. Sensing the danger, Benedict instructed a raven, a wild bird he fed daily, to carry the bread away and dispose of it where it could harm no one. The raven obeyed and symbolically revealed Benedict's relationship of mutual trust with the intelligence of organic life, suggesting a saint whose holiness includes interspecies cooperation rather than separation. Torvend further contends that many monastic Christians of this period literally understood Christ as the embodiment of the land and the radiant life of the sun, grounding his presence not in distant metaphysics, but in the fertile soil and luminous landscapes of Judean Palestine. From Christ's earthly ministry, his resurrection as the rising of light and life itself, and to his symbolic association with the Lamb, the creature most closely tied to pastoral landscapes, sacrificial renewal, and the nurturing dependence of life on the land, all reinforced an ecological vision of the sacred. Early monasticism, therefore, interpreted the Christian religion as fundamentally ecological, a cosmic and terrestrial renewal, rather than an escape from the material world. As Torvend declares that, quote, "From the practices and sayings of Jesus, there flowed into early Christian and monastic communities a form of worship that welcomed the gifts of the earth, a ritual gathering in which earth's materiality was clearly present. It was from these communities that contemporary assemblies have received their form of worship. Consider the fact that Christians, informed by the movement of the sun and moon, gather daily for prayer in the morning, at midday, in the evening, and at night. The Church's sense of time is governed by sunset and sunrise, dawn and darkness. The day begins with sunset. The week begins on Sunday, the day of resurrection, with its promise of new life. Those entering Christian faith and life are washed in local water, are anointed with olive oil, and receive a bread fragment and a sip of wine in what are now called the sacraments of initiation. Had they lived in the early centuries of Christianity, they would have also received a cup of milk mixed with honey, a taste of the promised land." Unquote. This book ultimately provided me with many new insights into Christianity, early medieval monasticism, and the symbolic significance of Christ, especially at a time when secular modernity has largely disenchanted the earth and reduced Christianity to either a moral system or a cultural relic, severed from its cosmological depth. Although I approached this book from a secular standpoint, interested primarily in the ecological and cosmological dimensions of the Christ narrative, I can understand why some readers might take issue with monastic values. Monastic life still rests on a universal moral vision and on a form of egalitarianism that redistributes life downward into a shared simplicity, one that could be perceived as a leveling process born of material scarcity. Torvend, however, would probably insist that monastic universalism could not be separated from its ecological valuation, and that monastic simplicity was conceived as a mode of abundance, measured by sufficiency, reciprocity, and the flourishing of the land itself, rather than scarcity. At the same time, when considering Christ in ecological terms, I could not help but think of the biblical story in which Christ drives a legion of demons from a human into a herd of pigs, a narrative that clearly complicates a purely ecological or egalitarian reading of Christianity, and demonstrates that Christ himself operated within a hierarchy of life that subordinated certain creatures to human and divine purposes. Nevertheless, this book was deeply valuable to me, particularly in helping me move beyond the standard secular, anthropocentric, and Promethean critique of Christianity. At number 1, Ecce Homo by Friedrich Nietzsche. I've dipped into many of Nietzsche's writings, most notably Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, and On the Genealogy of Morality. But this was the first time I was able to see many of his central concepts articulated from his own vantage point, and to gain a more unmediated understanding of how he conceived his own philosophical project. In the book, Nietzsche reflects on his life, health, writings, and artistic philosophical development, focusing in particular on how he transformed illness and periods of decadence into sources of great strength, and how specific individuals, sensibilities, and places shaped the evolution of his thought. Most notably, his relationship to the composer Richard Wagner and the writer Lou Andreas Salome were of decisive significance. In reconnecting Nietzsche to phenomenology, one of the most illuminating insights I gained from his self-account was the decisive role of climate, atmosphere, and environmental surroundings in the formation of his thought. Many of Nietzsche's philosophical intuitions were not produced in abstraction, but arose from the embodied encounters with the landscapes of his long alpine walks, the sharp mountain air, and the sensory clarity of higher altitudes. Indeed, the very figure of Zarathustra emerged through these embodied wanderings, shaped by the landscapes through which Nietzsche moved and the elemental forces he encountered in both the rural regions of the Alps and the more rugged urbanized localities of Genoa and Rapallo. As Nietzsche writes regarding the importance of place and climate, quote, "Most closely related to the question of nutriment is the question of place and climate. No one is free to live everywhere, and he who has great tasks to fulfill which challenge his entire strength has indeed in this matter a very narrow range of choice. The influence of climate on the metabolism, its slowing down, its speeding up, extends so far that a blunder in regard to place and climate can not only estrange anyone from his task, but withhold it from him altogether. He never catches sight of it." Unquote. In this context, Nietzsche argues that specific places and climates exert a metabolic influence on an individual. Some energize, sharpen the mind, and intensify one's drives, whilst others exhaust, extinguish, or erode an individual's capacities. To be forced into an unsuitable climate, or to choose the wrong one when a choice was possible, can be so devastating that an individual may never even glimpse at what they were capable of becoming, simply because the world around them never summoned those capacities forth. Nietzsche even suggests that the great cultural radiance of cities like Paris, Florence, Jerusalem, and Athens arose precisely from their dry air and clear skies, which cultivated a more rapid metabolism of energy and with it the formation of noble genius. Nietzsche also further relates the conditions and capacities of thought to psychic atmospheres, or more precisely, the types of psychologies other people inhabit, and that one's relation to particular individuals and societies can either elevate one's strength of spirit or corrode it, sharpening or dulling the very capacities through which thought and inspirited health becomes possible. Nietzsche himself often revered the conditions of certain Mediterranean societies, and by contrast, frequently portrayed Germanic localities such as Leipzig and Basel as having a deadening or depressive effect on his vitality and clarity of mind. For him, these Germanic environments slowed the metabolism of thought and weakened psychophysiological health. As Nietzsche affirms on the importance of psychic atmospheres for his personal flourishing, that, quote, "I perish under unclean conditions. I swim and bathe and splash continually, as it were in water, in any kind of perfectly transparent and glittering element. This makes traffic with people no small test of my patience. My humanity consists not in feeling for and with man, but in enduring that I do feel for and with him. My humanity is a continual self-overcoming, but I have need of solitude, that is to say recovery, return to myself, the breath of a free, light, playful air. My entire Zarathustra is a dithram on solitude, or, if I have been understood, on cleanliness." Unquote. In speaking of unclean conditions, Nietzsche is not talking primarily about physical dirt, but rather he is referring to the moralistic, resentful, unserious, and delirious psychic atmosphere conjured by the masses in most societies, as certain ordinary social interactions risk wading into murky waters, where opaque motives, mediocre values, petty emotions, and reactive states of mind fester in the nihilistic herd society. The symbolism of bathing and splashing in glittering water expresses his need for a world of empowering relations and an inner world of psychophysiological health and invigoration. He also acknowledges that his engagement with others is not grounded in pity-based compassion, but in self-mastery and endurance, so as to prevent himself from being leveled out by the pitiful and from seeing the world as merely an object of sorrow. From here, Nietzsche further recognizes the necessity of solitude in cleansing and recovering from what the herd society otherwise contaminates, through which the clear air of solitude enables him to restore his inner vitalism. In claiming that the figure of Zarathustra is the dithram on solitude, Nietzsche underscores the figure's significance as a symbol of aloneness, clarity, and dwelling above the fog of the herd. Just as Nietzsche advocates for a re-evaluation of values, Zarathustra withdraws from humanity to create new values in solitude before returning to engage with humanity. Central to Nietzsche's concept of overcoming is the capacity to see beyond the value system of Christian morality, which he argues continues to exert a defining influence on the ways in which modern humans understand themselves and the world they inhabit, from which he declares that, quote, "What defines me, what sets me apart from all the rest of mankind, is that I have unmasked Christian morality. That is why I needed a word which would embody the sense of a challenge to everyone. Not to have opened its eyes here sooner counts to me as the greatest piece of uncleanliness which humanity has on its conscience, as self-deception become instinct, as a fundamental will not to observe every event, every cause, every reality, as false coinage in Psychologists to the point of crime. Blindness in the face of Christianity is the crime par excellence." Unquote. From here, Nietzsche proclaims that his ability to expose and see beyond the legacies of Christian morality sets him apart from the rest of humanity, who continue to adhere, often unknowingly, to life-denying value systems even whilst believing themselves enlightened and liberated from myth. For Nietzsche, the residues of Christian morality within secular modernity compel people to instinctively deceive themselves about their own drives, instincts, and the nature of reality. These inherited habits of conscious perception still determine how modern, supposedly secular humans move toward massified, reactive, and eschatological modes of life. Nietzsche therefore claims he required a word or concept that embodies a universal challenge, a provocation directed at all, referring to the re-evaluation of all values, his direct confrontation with the long-standing dominance of Christian moral values. If you have made it this far into the video, I would like to thank you for watching and taking interest in my analysis. I hope that some of the books I have shared or the insights I have provided have been interesting, inspiring, or useful in some way or another. I will try to read as many books as I did this year for next year, although certainly nothing can be guaranteed. Anyways, goodbye for now, and I will see you next time.